Well, I think I will go ahead. I, we're gonna be talking about slavery this morning. It's so interesting. That's why I want to be sure everybody gets here, because I don't know whether I will be interesting, but the subject is very interesting and very surprising, even to the point of almost being shocking when you start looking at. I'm not going to talk about the Old Testament at all. Now, this class is about the New Testament. So I want to make some general statements about slavery in the time when the New Testament was being written in the early church, And then we'll look at some passages. And as I say, I think you'll be very surprised with what you see when we do that. The practice of human slavery was very, very prevalent and important in the Roman world. It was in the ancient world. It has been in the history of humankind. I don't know of any culture up until modern times, the last century or century and a half in the West, where human slavery has not been built into the economic fabric of every culture that I know of. It's what we live in is an exception to the human experience. And it certainly would have been an exception in the New Testament world. There have been various estimates about this. I think it's interesting, by the way, they say that the entire population of the Roman Empire was probably around 50 million. And of that, about 20% were slaves. And in fact, the percentage of slaves in the Roman Empire was so high, the Senate once had a bill before it to say, why don't we have the slaves to wear special clothing so we'll know, when we go to the marketplace or wherever we go, we will know who's a slave and who isn't. And the Roman Senate voted against that because they said if it becomes obvious to the slaves how many of them there are, they're liable to rebel. Because the other thing that's always been common in cultures that have slavery, which is pretty much all cultures have historically, the free side of the culture always lives in a certain amount of fear, sometimes bordering on terror, that the slaves are going to revolt, which they do ever so often. I don't know if you've seen Spartacus, the movie Spartacus. There was the very, very famous, in the sort of New Testament biblical period, the revolt of the slaves. So this would mean about 10 million slaves in the Roman Empire out of the 50 million. What did they do? Well, it's interesting. I don't know if this is exactly equivalent, but there was sort of, in the Roman Empire, there was sort of no blue collar class. There were poor people. Often they were on the public dole. The Romans, they always said, the emperor said, if you give them bread and circuses, they'll be satisfied. So there were lots of people who simply had no means of income. They just lived off of what we would call welfare, and went to the arenas and coliseums and things and spent most of their time there. But the people who actually sort of got the work done, and by that I mean people like the government bureaucracy on the lower levels. If you went in any kind of government office in the Roman Empire, the person who waited on you, the clerk, is almost certain to be a slave. That would be like the post office, or the equivalent of a Department of Motor Vehicles. Those people would all be government slaves. They would belong to the government. But they would do those government jobs. Civil service in general is on at least the lower levels, everybody but the supervisors. And often even the supervisors were, as I'll talk about that in a minute. So you went all the way from that, where it took training and education, to mine workers, which that was awful. These were people that worked in Spain or somewhere in the silver mines. they weren't expected to live very long. They just worked them to death. They were, I'll say more in a minute about where slaves came from. And often these were prisoners of war or something like that. They were considered to be expendable, and they just worked until they dropped. But a lot of that kind of work. The other one is the galley slaves who pull the oars to make the ships go. They'd lock them in there, and they probably never come out of that boat alive. They just row until they keeled over. So you had that, whereas often a government worker might live a fairly good life. They had probably not a very nice place to live. They just went to the office every day and did that sort of thing. Farm workers were almost always slaves. And there's some reflection of that in the New Testament. Landowners who have slaves who are taking care of the farms. There were household slaves. Almost everybody that did housework was a slave, and that would be rich people who had estates would have lots of slaves taking care of the the plants and the gardens and the orchards and so on. But they also had a lot of people inside the house. In many ways, the most desirable place to be if you were a slave was a household slave, because you were indoors, and you sort of lived and partook of the life of the people in the house. You lived in some sort of opulence, although it didn't belong to you. And your headquarters would be a very simple room somewhere in the back, or maybe even out with the animals. Just recently in Pompeii, by the way, for the first time, they found slave quarters in one of the houses there. They found the beds, actually, that the slaves slept on, and they found the slaves who had not gotten out when the eruption took place. This is very unusual to find a place where a slave lived. So anyway, that was kind of the situation. So an average person ran into slaves constantly, because any kind of interface you did with the public, any kind of office you went to, or any kind of job you wanted to have done, these were done by slaves. Well, where did all these people come from? These slaves, these millions of slaves. A major source was people who were born into slavery. If a woman had a child, a woman who was enslaved had a child, the child was automatically a slave. This was not true necessarily if the father might not be a slave, and that's a whole other issue. But if the mother was, then so there were, and these were considered to be very desirable slaves because they'd never known anything else. From their first consciousness, they had been told you are a slave and this is your lot in life. This is the way you live. So they just never thought any other way, and they tended to be of the least concern about rebelling or something like that. Then there were war captives, because the Romans were constantly fighting wars. And typically if a city was being besieged and held out, the Romans would say, if you don't give up, when we do take you over, we're going to destroy the city, we're going to sell everybody as a slave. And they did that. People by the thousands and thousands were simply chained and marched away back into the Roman Empire itself. These were usually countries around the border. And those people often, it was awful because they were often sent right to the mines, or, some sort of terrible slavery like that. An amazing number of people were slaves because they had gotten into debt and simply had to sell either themselves or members of their family. That was the last asset. Human beings were thought of as being an asset with a certain value, just in the same way that a horse would be, or a wagon would be, or a basket full of figs would be. They were just thought of that way. So if you had financial problems and you got further and further in debt, you were not considered to be bankrupt until you had sold yourself, your body. So that would be the last step. And often what a male would do is he would begin selling his children and then his spouse. And he would wait until last, hoping he could do something so he could get them back. But when he got in the situation where he had to sell himself, of course, the family was trapped in slavery from then on. That happened. That was not uncommon to happen. Also, big source were abandoned infants. There was no abortion. Abortion existed in the ancient world, but it was very dangerous. It was very unsafe. And so particularly in families who had some means, they would never take the chance of an abortion. What they did was they simply waited until the baby was born, and they literally usually would have another slave or a slave in the family simply take the newborn, maybe only a few hours old, and take it out to the city dump and just put it there. Now, the chances are it's going to survive because there are people for whom that is an asset. And so slave dealers would watch the dump all the time. And when the babies would be brought out there, they would immediately grab them and then they would be raised to be slaves. One of the first distinguishing characteristics of the Christians in what we might today call social action is they used to watch the dumps. And the minute they saw a baby put there, the Christian community would rush out and try to get the baby before it was taken over by a slave trader. And many members of the Christian community in the second generation had been rescued like that from the dumps. There's a letter that still exists from a Roman soldier writing home to his wife who is pregnant. And he gives this instruction. He said, when the baby comes, if it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it away. So this is the kind of situation that we had. And again, you just have to realize the definition of what it meant to be a human being was just different. It was just thought of in a very different way, or to be on the social scale in one place or another was just thought different. Some people were put into slavery as punishment for some crime they had performed. Some were simply kidnapped and taken someplace else and sold where people didn't know. And you could protest, I'm a free person, they've kidnapped me, but you didn't have a way of proving it. And so they would be slaves. Now, where did the slaves come from? We've got all these millions and millions of slaves. A lot of them came from Ireland, from Scotland. You notice I'm talking about places that are right on the edge of the Roman Empire, right around the edges. They came from Eastern European countries. In fact, the word slave comes from the word Slav, because so many slaves were Slavic. They were Hungarians, or they were Bulgarians, Czechs, people from that area. They came from around the Black Sea. Some were Russians or other people around the Black Sea. They came from the Arabian Peninsula. Some were. By the way, up until now, I make a little slice. Up until now, these have all been white. These are all white people. The vast majority of the slaves were white. When you get into the Arabian Peninsula, you begin to get brown slaves. And I would say that's what today we'd say Saudi Arabia or Jordan, and then Egypt and across North Africa. There were many slaves that came from North Africa. They were Arab. And then there were also black slaves from Central Africa. So pretty much anybody who was not a Roman citizen was a potential slave. And some people who were Roman citizens were potential slaves. but slavery was never based on race, and it was never based on ethnicity. They didn't really care. Now, they had theories about which ethnicities made better slaves. Romans, particularly sophisticated Romans, wanted to have Greek slaves because they considered the Greeks to be their superiors intellectually. And so they liked to have Greek slaves. The Greek slaves had a pretty nice time of it because they were quite often the tutor for the children in a wealthy family. Or they did something like that, or they would be made the master of the household. Or if the family had a business, they would sometimes actually be the supervisor for the family business. There were some other ethnicities too, but particularly Greeks they liked to have. So that was the situation. It's a pretty dismal thing to think about. I don't think the Roman Empire would have been the Roman Empire without slavery. Economically, culturally, it was just based on this idea. Well, what was life like for a slave? Well, I've already mentioned that depended a lot on which one of these categories of slavery you were put in. Some things you might find surprising, even the great Greek philosophers. Of course, Greece had the same system before the Romans took them over and made slaves out of a lot of them. But Aristotle described slaves as living property. That's Aristotle. Living property. Other of the Greeks referred to slaves as living tools. So you had tools like hoes and picks and things, but you also had slaves, and they were in that category, not in the human category, but in the category of tools. They had no legal rights. The laws of the land and so on simply did not apply to them. The master who owned them had absolute power over them. The master made all the rules and had no rules himself as to how he behaved toward his slaves. I found, by the way, an interesting statement by Seneca, the famous Roman moralist and philosopher, who shows that the Romans were not entirely, didn't feel comfortable often about the way they treated slaves. He lived right in the New Testament period. He's contemporary with Paul. And listen to this statement from Seneca. It is creditable to a man to keep within reasonable bounds in the treatment of his slaves. Even in the case of human chattel, one ought to consider not how much one can torture him with impunity, but how far such treatment is permitted by natural goodness and justice, which prompts us to act kindly toward even prisoners of war and slaves bought for a price, and not to treat them with scornful brutality as human chattels, but as persons somewhat below ourselves in station, who have been placed under our protection rather than assigned to us as servants. That's very high-minded. You see, there were people who thought that way. And we're going to come in a few minutes to statements in the New Testament about slaves and masters, and see that the New Testament writers, that Seneca sounds like somebody who could have, he sounds like the New Testament in the way he treated this. Okay, now it's picture time. I said I was going to break it at some point for picture time. And I want to just show you two pictures. We have a lot of pictures that show various elements of slavery in the New Testament world. I just picked a couple. Now, this is the bad side here. This man is obviously being beaten by his master. And I don't know what the point of doing this mosaic and having this picture on it, but you can see that this was, it's very quickly, anybody in Rome or even today, you look at it and you say, oh, that's a picture of a master and a slave. It just has all the qualities of it there. And the second picture Here you have a woman, a wealthy woman, and she has 3 slave girls. Actually, there are 4 slaves in this picture. Do you see that? There are the 3 who are doing her hair. And there's the little one down there, probably the child of one of the, these are household slaves. And one of them is holding a mirror so that the woman can see. If you go down to the Getty and you look at the hairstyles in where they have all the Roman statues, and look at those hairstyles. It took 3 or 4 slave girls hours and hours and hours and hours to do the hair of those women. And I find it very interesting that in 1st or 2nd Timothy, I think, or Titus, advice is being given to Christian women, and it says, don't let people know you for your hairstyle. I think that's interesting. And it's kind of an oblique reference to this practice of having slaves that pretty much all they did was just work on your hair because it was so like, I'd love to, when I used to take students down to the Getty, I love to go in that room and just say, particularly to the girls in the group, I'd say, just go around and look at those and think, how could you get your hair to look like that? What would it take? Well, it would take slavery, or that's what it took in the Roman world. Now, you didn't have to be a slave forever in the Roman world. There was what they called manumission. You could be freed. It was not real common, but it did happen. And it might happen simply by a master who came to love a slave. A lot of times these people had grown up in the master's house, grown up with their children. They just had a strong emotional attachment, even to the point of love. And there are even inscriptions where somebody says, my so-and-so who was my slave and now is my son, you know. So there were things like that, or just somebody who had served faithfully, maybe in the master's will, he would say, you know, I want all of my servants or these following servants to be freed. But once you became freed, they call these freedmen. Once you became a freedman, you were still a part of your master's household, and you owed them your freedom, and therefore, you know, you whatever favor they asked of you, you felt obligated to do. They had certain duties that they continued with. You could move out of slavery into high positions. In the book of Acts, one of the Roman governors that Paul appears before in his trials at Caesarea before he's sent to Rome when he appeals to Caesar, one of the governors was named Felix, and Felix was a freedman. Felix had once been a slave, and he has worked himself up to the governor of a province. That's pretty amazing. Now, he was probably a slave of the emperor. If you were fortunate enough to become a slave of the emperor, well, that could be real bad, depending on what assignment you were given. But if you had talent, it was kind of like moving through government bureaucracy, and you can move up quite high. You had to pay, a lot of slaves when they got free, they had to pay their master whatever they would be worth, their market value as a human chattel. And the way you got that money was they had a system that was, the master could establish a peculium, which meant it was kind of like you were allowed to have your own bank account. And when you made money in whatever way, it still belonged to your master, but he would allow you to keep it in your bank account. And if you could get enough in there to be what your market value would be, you could give it to the master and he would give you freedom. It was a kind of an economic arrangement that was made. And that was more or less out of the goodness of the heart of the master, because technically the money already belonged to him, but they would go through this thing, so you could pay yourself off, or maybe a member of your family. Another way to get freed from slavery is to marry. Women sometimes are freed by marrying the master, particularly if they had had a child by the master. Sometimes the master wanted that child to not be considered to be a slave or to be an illegitimate child, and so he would free the mother. So these kinds of things happen. Well, it's a pretty dismal thing, and of all the glories of the Roman Empire that you think about, you have to realize how much of it was built on the backs of enslaved people. Now, I want to turn to slavery in the New Testament, and I don't know if you'll find this as surprising as I did when years. I've known all this for many, many years, but I remember just thinking to myself, "Goodness me!" I recently read, there was a whole genre of literature written in the 1840s and 50s in the United States, in which Southern biblical scholars wrote 300 and 400 page books on why it's all right to have slavery. Biblical scholars are writing these books. They are amazing books to read, by the way. And that somebody it's hard for us to think anybody today could write a 300 or 400 page book justifying slavery on the basis of the Bible. You think, how could they do that? I suggest sometime you might want to read one of those books. It'll make you very angry, but you'll be amazed. And there's a reason they could do that, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes. But let's just look at slavery in the New Testament. It's all over the New Testament. It's there much more than you would ever realize. So I can just pick a few places. In Matthew chapter 8, there's this story about Jesus healing. Remember that when you read the word servant in the New Testament, you've got to read it as slave. I'm not sure why the translators don't just go ahead and translate. The word is doulos, and it just means slave. But so often they translate it as servant. Anyway, there's this story. Remember this story? The centurion comes to Jesus and he says, my servant, my slave is very ill, and will you heal him? And he says, you don't have to come to my house because I order people around and they obey me. And I know that you can just say, be healed, and he'll be healed. You don't have to come. You get the feeling of a rather tender relationship between this servant and the centurion. Now, maybe he was just interested in not losing his property, but I have the feeling that there was more to it than that. It's a very interesting story, Matthew chapter 8. The thing I want to point out to you right now, and I'm just gonna raise this, and I'll raise it a couple of more times. Why didn't Jesus say to him, well, the first thing you need to do is free that man because slavery is wrong? He never says a word about the fact that the boy was a slave. He just talks about that he's ill and that he's going to heal him of the illness. Just park that in your mind a little bit. Now you go to Matthew chapter 18, and that's the story we sometimes call the parable of the unmerciful servant. Remember this story? Read again, the unmerciful slave. Now here's an interesting situation because you have a slave who's obviously operating a business. He's gotten himself into debt with his master, with his owner. And it's far more debt than he can pay back. And so he's going to be sent into some far worse kind of slavery. And he begs with his master and says, no, forgive me, I'll pay you back, I'll pay you back. And then later on, the master is not there, and he leaves this guy in charge of all of his affairs. You see, this is slavery where somebody has worked their way up, have a pretty comfortable life, even though he's still a slave. But some of the men that are working for him, who are also the slaves of the master, but lower down the chain, they start owing the slave who is the supervisor money. And he is unmerciful to them. You pay me back no matter what. And when the master finds out about it, remember how he says, you know, I forgave you, and you didn't forgive, therefore you go to the bottom. So he loses all of the privileges. It's interesting that Jesus tells the story without any reference to the institution of slavery. Now, he doesn't picture it in a good light, but he doesn't say, you know, the first thing that's wrong here is that anybody is a slave. It's a parable not about slavery, it's a parable about mercy and forgiveness. Just park that in your mind. Now, in Luke chapter 17, Jesus comments again about slavery. It's starting in the 7th verse. Listen to this. Suppose one of you has a slave plowing or looking after the sheep. Will he say to the slave when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready and wait on me while I eat and drink. After that, you may eat and drink. Will he thank the slave because he did what he was told to do? Implied, no, he won't thank him. So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy slaves. We have only done our duty. I don't know. I've heard that. I've heard these all my life. I remember hearing it say, I never thought, hey, okay, wait a minute. You know, I get the point, but what about slavery? It just doesn't say anything about. In fact, he just says, you know how it is with slaves and masters, and he doesn't say now it shouldn't be. He just says, no, you know, the slave doesn't say, well, after I eat, I'll fix your meal. No. He fixes the master's meal and then he eats. That's the way it works. And he just passes on. He just describes slavery the way it functioned without making any judgment on one way or the other. And then you begin to get the use of slave and master language in Paul used theologically, which I find very interesting. I won't mention specific passages, but in Romans and in Galatians, you will find this idea that you are a slave. Now, you're either a slave to sin or you're a slave to Christ. And you have some choice as to which you want to be a slave to. But there's this idea, I think this is interesting, by the way, because, you know, we have this, what religion will do the most for you? And what kind of a worship service do you get the most out of? And what kind of church pleases you? And so on. This is very interesting because there's a whole strain in the New Testament that says you relate to God as a slave relates to their master. You're not a customer, you know, picking which store you want to shop in. Which religion offers you the most? That Paul pictures the human race's relationship to the master of the universe as a relationship between slave and master. Not a bunch of people looking for a God who'll do for them things, make life nice for them, and answer to their wants and so on. They just don't think that way. By the way, Islam is even more pointed on that. I'm pretty sure, somebody correct me if you know, I don't know what the level of Arabic knowledge may be in class here, but I think Abdul, the very common Abdul, the name Abdul means slave of God, doesn't it? Anyway, one of the very most common of all Muslim names means the slave of God. And when Muslims worship, you notice the position they get in when they pray? This is obviously based on the idea that they are a slave in front of a master. And this language is very common in the letters of Paul. But I know you think, aren't you going to give me any good news here? But when you begin to get, when slavery is discussed as slavery in the New Testament, which it is in a few places, it's very interesting to see what it says. I just picked 2 or 3 here. Colossians 3, verse 11. There is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. Now that was hugely revolutionary. That's, by the way, that's way above what Seneca said. Now what Seneca said was a good and moral and human thing to say about how people ought to treat slaves. But it's not like saying there is in Christ neither slave nor free. Everybody who is in Christ is in Christ. And these kind of distinctions do not apply. The Christians from the very beginning believed that their primary relationship with one another grew out of their relationship to Christ. If you are in Christ, you are my brother or sister. I don't care what your racial background is, what your social background, your economic background. It's if we are in Christ, Christ is all in all, and those distinctions don't apply anymore. On the other hand, and interestingly, in the same chapter, Colossians 3, verse 22, he's giving instructions to various people in society. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Isn't that interesting? It's very interesting. In Christ, there is neither slave nor free. But if you're a slave, be a good slave. Obey your master. And then in Colossians 4, he gets to the master. And he said, here's what he says. By the way, again, in the conflict that we had pre-Civil War here, the abolitionist side worried about it sometimes in their writings. Why didn't Paul say in Colossians 4, masters, free your slaves? Actually, Paul did not say that. He said, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. He doesn't specifically attack the institution, but he attacks the relationship within the institution. Again, in a far higher, morally sophisticated way than the highest Romans did, like Seneca. Now, so why you don't find a specific condemnation of slavery in the New Testament? And the last question I'm going to have, I know we're going to run out of time, but I want us to talk sometime in this class about why. Why is there not a statement somewhere there that says, don't do it, it's not right? You don't find that. You do find in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 10, slave masters, I should say not slave masters, slave traders. Slave traders are put in the lowest of the low, despicable human beings. They are put there. He makes a distinction between slave masters and slave traders, or appears to. Anyway, he lists the slave traders. You know, Amazing Grace was written, was it not, by a man who had been a slave trader. Look at the words of that song again sometime and realize that. And realize what he must have gone through in his conversion to Christ when he had been a slave trader. I got to sit at his desk where he wrote that once. fantastic experience. I like to be where something happened, and I just sat there and thought, I can't believe I'm sitting in the chair at the desk where he wrote Amazing Grace. Saved a wretch like me. A slave trader.
Hey, John,
Yes.
Nancy chimed in a few minutes ago. She looked up Abdul, and yeah, it does mean slave.
Okay, oh, good, great, thank you. I was right. It's always nice to be right. Especially when you're not sure whether you are or not. Then in Titus, chapter 2, verse 9, teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them and not talk back to them. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better because their masters are dear to them as fellow believers and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. Now, there you see the writer changing the institution, the relationship between the slave and the master. He changes the nature of the institution. He does not seem to be changing the institution. We'll come back to that. Not this morning. I don't want to make false promises. We'll come back to it. And then an interesting statement that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 through 4, through 21 through 24. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you gain your freedom, if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freeman. And that's interesting. He's using the language of the institution. One who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You see how he uses the analogy. You were bought at a price. He's not talking to slaves who were bought at a price. He said, you, free, supposedly free person that you were bought with a price. The crucifixion of Jesus, the death of Jesus. Do not become slaves of human beings. Now there's a statement. It's not exactly do away with slavery, but he says, don't become slaves of human beings. I'm not sure whether he's talking about the institution of slavery or whether he's talking about a kind of moral and ethical relationship to other human beings. That we could talk about. But anyway, brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And that's beginning to get to the issue that we'll have to wait for another Sunday. But it's, I'm just going to say a little bit about it. I want to make us late to church. Just a little bit, so you won't think, what is this guy talking about and why did he leave us like this? What I've noticed, there are a lot of social ills in the first century Roman Empire. Terrible social ills. We'll be talking later in class about the patriarchy or the relationship of males and females, gender issues, issues of social distinctions, the rich and the poor. There are all kinds of what we would call today social justice issues. They are almost never directly addressed in the New Testament. They're there, like I've shown you here. The slavery is all over the New Testament, but they're not directly dealt with, and there's a big issue as to why. Let me just throw you out a thesis. You can think about this, and maybe you can be ready to. If you don't think this is any good, I'll be happy to take some contrary views. It seems to me that the early Christians lived under a government in which they knew they had absolutely no influence to change anything. They did not live in a changeable world. It was like it had always been. And they had no reason to think it was not going to be like that forever. I mentioned at the beginning of class, slavery, like I've described today, has existed in all cultures, all through human history, until our own day. And by the way, only in a few places in the world today. And sometimes we just change the names, but the institution is still there. So it did not occur to them that any of those things could change. The Christians, the issue for the Christian in the first century church was not how to change the Roman Empire. It was how to live as a Christian in it. It was how to live as a servant of Christ in a world that has a lot of terrible things going on. And how do I live within that? And so I don't mean to say that the early Christians weren't interested in these, what we would today call social issues, but they were not relevant in the sense that anything could be done. I think actually probably the reason we're a little different today is because we actually think we could do something about it. I don't think this ever occurred. I don't think Paul had any sense that he was going to change any governmental policies. Now he wanted to say, I'm a Roman citizen and I have my rights as a Roman citizen. But he didn't say, I think the empire I think you ought to change this rule about this or that. Or I think what you're doing, economically, you shouldn't do it that way. Or you just don't find that kind of talk in the New Testament, not because it's not relevant to the Christian. And maybe we'll want to talk about what do we do in a world in which we feel some obligation to change the world around us, but that was just not on their agenda. It was not that was a totally impossible dream. And so that seems to me to be the reason there's no verse in the Bible that says abolish slavery. The verses all tend to be masters do this, slaves do this, in Christ this, in Christ that. That's what we get. Think about that. I give you, I give you a month or two to think about that one and come back and tell me if you think that's the reason. And that's the reason, by the way, these Southern biblical scholars could write whole books and say, look, there's nothing in the Bible that says you can't own slaves. I think they were just as wrong as they could be, except they're technically right. They're just spiritually wrong as they can be. You got to go because you got to go to church, right? Thank you.
Thank you, George.